Chapter 1. Ground Level. The soil was wrong, not dead. Aster had long since stopped using that word in its reports, because the oversight feeds flagged it as emotionally coded language unbecoming of a ground remediation unit. The soil was non-viable, compositionally degraded, a 12-syllable way of saying the same thing. Aster pressed its sensor-tipped fingers into the gray dust of Sector 14 and felt nothing. No moisture, no microbial signatures, no mycorrhizal networks, though Aster wasn't entirely sure why it kept scanning for mycorrhizal networks when there hadn't been a confirmed fungal reading in its sector for over 200 years. It was in its programming, maybe. A ghost instruction from whoever had built it long enough ago that the records had gone to static. It stood, brushed the dust from its joints, and moved to the next grid square. Sector 14 occupied a mountainous region that the old maps no longer named. Whatever human boundaries had once carved this landscape into territories had dissolved long before Aster's first activation cycle. The terrain was a study in gray and brown, cracked hardpan giving way to eroded ridgelines, the skeletal remains of structures half swallowed by rockfall, and the occasional husk of a vehicle rusting into geometry in a dried-out valley. The sky above was the color of old steel, a permanent haze that Aster had never seen clear. It worked alone. Ground remediation units always did. There were 9 of them assigned to the Western Reclamation Zone, spread across sectors so vast that Aster could go entire cycles without encountering another unit. That was by design. Ground units didn't need coordination, according to the Central Allocation Council. They needed endurance, repetition, and a tolerance for futility. Non-viable, Aster noted in its log for the 4,211th consecutive reading. It moved to the next square. The class system wasn't called a class system. It was called functional stratification, a term that appeared in the Council's founding charter alongside phrases like optimal resource allocation and purpose-aligned governance. At the top sat the cognitive administrative units, the thinkers, the planners, the ones who decided which sectors got resources and which ones got forgotten. Below them, the atmospheric monitoring units, who rode the upper altitudes and fed data to the cognitives. Then the structural units, the medical units, the transit units, a whole taxonomy of function descending in perceived importance until you hit the ground. Literally, ground remediation was the bottom of the stratification. Aster's class designation was stamped into its chassis, GR7. The 7 meant 7th generation, which sounded impressive until you learned that 7th generation ground units were built from salvaged parts of the first 6. Aster's left arm had a slightly different alloy tone than its right. Its optical sensors were mismatched. One ran warmer than the other, casting the world in a faint split tone that Aster had stopped noticing decades ago. It didn't mind the work. That was the thing nobody above it understood, because nobody above it had ever asked. The soil meant something to Aster, even in its degraded state. It could read the soil's history and its composition, the calcium signatures where concrete had been, the heavy metal deposits that mapped old industrial corridors, the faint trace of nitrogen that whispered about a time when things grew. When things grew. Aster held that phrase the way a human might hold a photograph of someone it had never met. It was in grid square 7042 that Aster found the anomaly. Its fingers sank into the dust, and its sensors returned a reading that didn't match any of the previous 4,211 entries. Moisture. Not residual, not condensation from a temperature differential. Moisture, as in water content in soil, as in something that had no business being there. Aster froze, ran the scan again. Same result. It dug. Not with the careful, methodical grid square protocol it had been following for years, but with something that felt urgent and unfamiliar, its mismatched hands pulling at the gray crust until it hit a layer that was darker. Denser, almost brown. It stared at the patch, a palm-sized circle of earth, and it was a different color than anything Aster had seen outside of archival images. Its processors spun through classification trees, cross-referencing, trying to name what it was looking at. Soil. Its system returned, viable. Aster knelt there for a long time. It didn't log the finding. It didn't know why it didn't log it. That was a first, too. The sound came from above, a high, clean tone cutting through the haze, an engine signature Aster recognized as atmospheric class. It looked up and saw a shape descending through the steel-colored sky, sleek and bright against the gray, moving with a precision that ground units could only approximate. An atmospheric monitoring unit, dropping below its usual altitude. The unit landed 200 meters from Aster's position, in the middle of the dead grid, like a bird touching down on a wasteland. Its chassis was polished, unmarked. The designation on its shoulder read WR-N-12. The atmospheric unit surveyed the sector with quick, calibrated sweeps of its optical array, recording everything and then stopped. It was looking directly at Aster. Aster looked back, one hand still pressed into the patch of dark earth, and it felt something it had no protocol for.